Thanks very much, Martin, and thank you for the invitation, Mick and the crew to come and speak. When Mick called me last year, he said, "I'm putting this program together early next year, don't have a lot of time, might be 40 people, and I want you to talk about the influence of genetics across the value chain." And I thought that'd be great, because there's only a few people, and I have a few reasonably strong views about that, and I thought that'll be great to have a bit of a chat. Then he calls the other day and says, "Oh, I've got about 400. So I did go through a very short phase of wondering whether I should change my talk, and I decided not to. So, and because the challenge that we have when we think about genetics in the value chain, and it's been sort of indicated already, I think, is that largely we're very front-loaded. And as Rod, I think, put it very well, you know, we start out with 100% influence from genetics, and then what we're left with is the bits that we don't mess up. And sadly, we actually mess up most of it, because we actually have no or very little opportunity or very little mechanism to use genetic information or genetic tools to make decisions or influence our decisions and influence the way we run our businesses past breeding better bulls. And frankly, that's actually not good enough for us. And we look at things like this here, where we've got, you know, really high quality product. We've had this massive increase in production of high quality product, and we look at cuts like those cube rolls there and say, you know, this is fantastic, and imagine the genetics behind those. But that's what we've got to do. We've got to imagine them, because we actually don't know. And we've got no way of telling, and we can now take a sample off the best ones, or we could test back to the size, and we can make some really good stories about the influence of those bulls and what they did 4 years ago, which isn't particularly useful for making the decision about how long we might feed him or when we might kill him. And that's part of the problem, because we can only kill him once. So when we find out right at the end the benefit of the decision that we made right at the start, we've got this massive gap in the middle, which creates a real challenge for us. Now, some of those cuts probably came off cattle like the ones on the right, and we know there's some genetics in those because we know they're Wagyu crosses. So that's how we think about genetics. We think about breeds. We know that they're black. That's how we think about genetics. We actually can't use very much once we get past making a bull breeding decision. We can't use much of the genetic information or genetic technologies to actually make a better informed decision, to change the way we run our business, to make a decision about appropriate markets, to respond to changing weather conditions, to respond to, you know, change in our environmental situation. We've got more or less grass. How do we actually make a decision which allows our cattle to perform better or maximise the value from them based on their genetic merit? And we know that there's a massive difference in value on genetics only if we can exploit that. So we've got to find a way to actually do this quite differently. So I'm going to talk more about the value chain rather than the influence of genetics across the value chain, because as far as I see it, the influence of genetics across the value chain is actually really limited. We talk a lot about it right at the start. We've done a fantastic job of developing and applying technologies in breeding better bulls. But as far as influencing the rest of the value chain with genetic information and genetic tools, we really have fallen short. And our whole value chain has some real challenges to it. And there's some other fundamental changes that have to be put in place in order for us to be able to get better value and to motivate people to use genetic information to make better decisions. So we've got to be able to have a sustainable, profitable value chain for all stakeholders. We know genetics can play a role in this, but at the moment they really don't. So what's the future hold for the beef, for the industry, and very much, you know, the value chain? We know things are going to change, and we know they're going to change significantly. We've heard a bit about that already, but we still spend a lot of time talking about what we've done, how we've done it, and how we can do those things better. And there's this massive amount of examples, I'm going to talk about a few of them this morning, where people have been in extremely good positions, they're well established, they've had long-term performance, they've got technology which is world-leading or was world-leading, they've made massive gains over time, but then they actually fall in a heap because they've got too confident, too arrogant, too much hubris, haven't paid attention, have felt that they could ride it out, whatever it might have been. And I really fear that our industry is falling into that case at the moment. And if you need enough examples, and there's things that people talk about all the time around Uber and taxis and around Airbnb and motels, around Facebook and newspapers, but there's also other much better examples to what we're looking at around things like videos and CDs and online streaming. You know, Blockbuster could have actually bought Netflix for millions of dollars, so very, very small amount of money many years ago, but they decided that download speeds would never get to the point where people would actually watch that sort of content online, so they didn't think it was a worthwhile business opportunity. So now Netflix has gone through the roof as far as market capitalisation, and Blockbuster doesn't exist at all. And there's plenty of those sorts of examples where we can look at things that were well established and they didn't necessarily respond to what was coming down the pipe, and I really fear that's the position we're in the beef and meat industry. But there are other things which are good news. So movies survive. So who would have thought 20 years ago, with videos and CDs and streaming coming along, that movie theatres would survive? They're surviving, they're building new ones, and they're actually doing better. So there is good news in it. But there's some really good examples that we can look at that should give us some guidance about the need for us to make decisions, and significant decisions about changing the way that we do things. I'm sure everybody knows who Nokia is. We all probably had a Nokia at one stage. They were the world-leading supplier of mobile phones. The interesting thing was that in 2007 and 8, right at the start of the smartphone revolution, Nokia actually had all the technology before everybody else. They had touchscreen technology, they had the application technology, they had all of the technology that actually drove the introduction of smartphones before everybody else. But their decision was that we will decide when we actually implement that and when we put it into place. And we all know what's happened to Nokia now. Interestingly, this is what the CEO said at the time: we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. And that could sound a lot like us, wouldn't it? I've got great information. I've been putting all my data in the system. I know that I'm making genetic gain when I measure how my bulls are producing, but somehow we got run over by something that came along downstream, and what were my customers are now making very different decisions with things that I never thought of, and they don't need my bulls anymore. So we've got to be careful that we don't end up being in a position that creates a challenge for us. And one of our generation's greatest philosophers, Mike Tyson, when he was asked about Evander Holyfield's plan before one of their fights, he said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And we've got to be really careful that we're looking out for what the punch in the mouth is going to be for us. Because it's not all bad news. We can run all these things through and say, this is going to be a disaster because of all the changes. But there's plenty of examples how you can respond, and industries and people in much worse positions than what we are in now as far as our challenge goes. And so Best Buy is an electronic big box retailer in the US. If you don't know who they are, they're sort of Bunnings style, not quite Bunnings size, but just to give you some context, massive electronic stores. They were huge retailers all over the US, been around for a long time, but really challenged by the new technology. So this is a 2011 article that Best Buy is going to be doomed. They're going to get run over by Amazon. This is what happened to their share price, $56 down to $11. They then went into China. You should be in China, everybody should be in China, but that was a disaster. They had to pull out of China. But they actually responded. They changed their fundamental business model. They got a much better online presence. They got a better way to engage with their customers. They redesigned their stores. They still provide electronics. They provide them in a much better, more efficient way, and now they're a much more successful business. Yesterday, the share price of Best Buy was $73. Now, if you said, who's likely to get run over by Amazon? It's like, well, it's an electronic retailer that sells individual items that people are going to add on to their other bits and pieces they need at home. But you don't have to be. You can be responded. You can respond to it. But then if you don't, so this is Radio Shack. So most of us would remember Radio Shack. And they went the other way. So that's what would have happened to $10,000 if you invested in Radio Shack in 2008. It would have been worth just over $1,000 in 2015, which is right after they bought a Super Bowl ad, the most successful marketing thing that people think you can do, buy a $5 million Super Bowl ad. And 3 months later, they actually went broke because they didn't actually respond. So you've got two very, very similar businesses. One disappears, and one actually becomes much more successful than it ever was before. And we somewhat live in a bubble as far as our industry is concerned, because we're so fragmented and we don't have a close enough connection through to our end user. I think we run the risk of convincing ourselves that things are actually okay and we are actually on the right track and we are actually doing things fast enough. But you look at this change over a 11 or 12 year period of what's happened to the leading businesses in the world, and on the right, we've largely got, so we've got fuel companies, we've got services and service companies like Citigroup, we've then got supply companies and diversified companies like GE. Microsoft's the only one that carries over. Now this data is only 12 months old. Now on the left-hand side, Facebook's now about 500 billion. The other three in the middle are just over 700, or they're all in the 700s, and Apple's now $850 billion in market cap. But very different businesses that are now running and driving what the leading position in the world. Now they're technology companies, they're companies that are attached to their end users, they understand what their customers need, they're providing a service and things which are demanded by their end users. They're not just making up stuff which they think is what's going to be most usable downstream. They're not disconnected from the end user, like we largely are with our genetic information. So we think about our end user, we think about how we want to apply and how we want to make progress and capture value from that progress. It's getting much closer down to the end user. So how do we actually think about this change? We've got to think outside the square of what we've done in the past. If we really genuinely actually want to make progress and we want to make genetic progress, we want to apply genetic information and technology more broadly across the industry, we have to fundamentally think differently to what we've done in the past. We've got awesome systems. They're fantastic. They are world-leading systems. We've been world leaders in the way they've been developed and the way they've been implemented. But we've got to keep changing and keep evolving. And there's some good quotes from a couple of these people here. Someone like Henry Ford saying if he had have actually asked people what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse. But he had to do something different. And Steve Jobs, on the other hand, is talking about focus groups and about how do you get information from people. And one of the challenges, if we just ask the same people the same thing, then they're largely just going to tell us what they know. And how can they actually tell us something new or something that's another opportunity when they actually have no concept of what that might be? So you think about how things have changed in other sectors, other parts of the industry. 25% of the $200 billion US advertising spend now goes with Google and Facebook. Apple is only 11% of the smartphone sales volumes, but they're 79% of the profit. And there's another bit I want to talk about Apple as far as how they apply things, which is very relevant to what we do. Amazon grew their sales by 50% to be 43% of the online sales, so doubling their sales in that 1 year. This here's the supply of Apple smartphones. So somewhere under 50%, it's more than 35, but it's less than 50% of the Apple components aren't even made by Apple. And they don't care. They make a product that we all want. They're only 11% of the market, but it's a massively profitable product. So does it actually matter? We talk about data and information, and I'm frustrated by the inability, and I think Peter's comment was very timely about there's this massive amount of information out there, but we're worried about who owns it and where it is and how do we connect it. It's like, far out, just solve the problem. Well, someone's going to do it for us. People are going to work out how to get this done if we actually don't take the leadership and do it ourselves, because the most important thing is what comes out the other end. How do we actually get better information to make better decisions? So content control is rapidly becoming less important. It's actually rapidly becoming unimportant. Facebook don't own any content, but they supply more content than most other people in the world put together. Apple doesn't care where the parts come from. What they care about is that they provide us with a service or with a product that we then utilise. They've got an open source approach. Anybody can build an Apple app. But here we are thinking that we're going to make genetic progress and drive forward, and we're going to be arguing about who owns what and what's stored where right at the very start before we even do anything with it. So we've got to find a way to be thinking long term and further downstream, and how do we get closer to that consumer so we know more about the customer or the product, we know more about what happens before we have to kill it, and then retrospectively be able to say, well, that was interesting, but we can't do anything about it now. Service and convenience, information and utility are going to be the drivers of value, not who's holding the data, not who had the initial sample or piece of information or where that came from. It's what we actually do with it and how we actually turn that information that can become a decision tool and a piece of technology information that we can use further downstream. Knowing what people need, when and where they need it, so that they can make better and more timely decisions is what should be one of the biggest drivers for how we think about the downstream supply chain application of our genetic information. Because this is one of our biggest challenges. We create this echo chamber of discussion about what we should do and how we should do it. And if we have the same people with the same knowledge and the same experience trying to solve new problems, our level of confidence about solving the problem goes up, but the quality of our decision actually goes down. And we've got to find a way to do the things that we talk about, to get further downstream, to understand about consumers, understand about customers, think about how do we develop and make tools. We've got all these fantastic decision-making tools that MLA and the Departments of Ag have developed over the years around pastures and weather forecasting and growth rates and managing information, but we don't have any way to put genetic information into those because we can't collect it and we can't capture it. So we've got to find a way to get out of our current roundabout of how we think about and manage and develop technology and information related to genetics and work out how we can get much further downstream with our plans. So what do we need to consider? The impact and use of genetics and genetic information is heavily weighted at the front end of the supply chain. The original draft of that said it's all at the front end of the supply chain, but let's just say it's heavily weighted. We need information and tools that are readily available and directly applicable to decision making downstream in the supply chain. We've got to be able to generate, capture, utilise genetic information much, much deeper into the supply chain than breeding and using a better bull. And it's not just retrospective information about how well did that bull then perform. It's what do we now know about cattle that are further downstream? How can we make a better decision? How do they go into a feedlot and how are they going to perform on a efficiency point of view, on a quality point of view, on an animal health point of view? How do we actually capture and manage that information and utilise it more effectively downstream? So breeding better bulls has been great, but we actually really need a lot more. As an industry, as a supply chain that's going to have enough challenges to it, it's actually not going to be good enough for us going forward if our genetic programs are just breeding better bulls. We absolutely need a lot more than that. So I'm about right. So global demand for red meat proteins continues to increase. There's a fantastic opportunity for us. The opportunities right across our supply chain are huge, but to realise even part of that opportunity, we've got to be better at delivering consistent, high quality product to our consumers. Genetics have to play a significant role in doing that. They can play a significant role in doing that, but right now they don't. They don't play anywhere near the role that they potentially can much further down our supply chain, and that's the challenge for us, to be able to take the technological base that we have, to take the fantastic systems that we've developed, to take the approach and the resources that we have in our industry already, be able to look for and find the new technologies that we can apply on a more commercial, more downstream basis across our supply chain so we can make these much better decisions. Because we sure as hell can be guaranteed that if we don't, someone else will either do it for us or they'll do it to us. Thank you.